Last week, Q and I inherited his grandmother's cedar chest. This chest had been sitting in his dad's house for the last 30 years, and no one apparently has touched it. It's just kind of been tucked away in a corner. And as the oldest of 4 kids, Q was elected to the one to curate the family history. So we started sorting through everything in there, and we learned a ton about his family, particularly his grandmother Hazel and his great-grandmother Christine. We even went so far as now we're trying to figure out if he's somehow related to my sister-in-law. His grandmother's maiden name is the same as my sister-in-law's maiden name, and they're all from the same town. But we haven't figured it out for sure yet. Anyway, with all of that happening, there's all the, it's just cool to see all of the stuff in there. This chest is filled with hundreds of old pictures and papers, but also random pieces of fabric, little tiny pieces of scraps up to a few yards of some of the fabrics. It seems a bizarre combination. There's important papers in there. There's things like Q's grandfather's induction papers into World War II. They still have those, but also a little scrap of fabric that's, I don't know what it could possibly be used for. It seems useless. But if we think about that Depression-era attitude, you can think about why every little thing was saved. There's from old Christmas letters to a small scrap of extra cotton. It all might have a use. It may be needed sometime. The Depression caused a lens of scarcity. People didn't have enough, and they began to save everything, hoarding things so they could make it through the scarcity. You never knew when something could be useful. They had the scarcity lens through which they saw everything. And the widow that we read about this morning was living in a similar situation. She was living in the midst of a massive drought, a drought that had been predicted by the prophet Elijah. If you remember last week, I mentioned that the ravens had brought food to Elijah when he was out in the desert. This is that same story. Elijah is out hiding in the desert from Ahab and Jezebel because they want to kill him for what he did to their Baal prophets. It's this ongoing fight. And so he's hiding out in the desert in the midst of a drought. So eventually, even the water dries up. Elijah has nothing left to drink, so he has to go and find some help. The ravens were smart enough to bring him food, but they couldn't manage to bring him water. So this is where God sends him to the widow of Zarephath. Elijah finds her out collecting some sticks, and he asks her first for a drink of water, and then he asks her for some food. She's willing to give him a drink of water, but when he asks for food, she says, I don't really have much left. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare this last little bit of food for myself and for my son, that we may eat it and die. She has given up. They're almost out of food. She's preparing to cook their very last meal and then just die. She's lost all hope. She cannot imagine any way forward. All she can see is the scarcity around her. Now, we could call her very practical. We could call her bitter. She's given up in a world which she thinks will never have enough. As a widow, she's feeling completely alone, and she's desperate, and she's resigned herself and her son to death. The scarcity is just so strong, she cannot see beyond it. We can get into that same kind of mindset if we're not careful. For us, often it isn't as dire as no food or no water in the midst of a drought or rations in the midst of a war, but we still start to see everything as not enough. Often we fall into that scarcity mindset in the church. As we see fewer people on Sunday morning, we see attendance become a competition. We talk about stealing sheep from another church instead of reaching out to folks that have never been part of a church. We fear ecumenical work together with other churches because we're afraid that somehow we're going to lose members to a different church. We start to hoard things. We hoard our money, our knowledge, our talent. We begin to look inward and downward. We even become suspicious of others, and we struggle to trust. We start to make excuses and blame other people for our reality. We get stuck in the past and we say things, but we've always done it that way. Any sort of change is blocked by fear. And instead of trying something new, we don't try anything at all because we're frozen by scarcity. And we can be the same way in our homes and our families as well. This isn't just a church attitude. I know after being a single mom for years, I am very wary of spending too much money. I question frivolous purchases a lot. And to me, frivolous means anything that's not really, really necessary. I have to be really careful because I can let scarcity control my worldview and let scarcity take away my joy. I can slide into worrying about the future instead of hoping for the future. But what if instead of a scarcity mindset, we have an abundance mindset, a mindset of generosity and collaboration? What if we see the world as the Good Samaritan did in our gospel reading that we heard this morning? Usually when we talk about the Good Samaritan, we're talking about loving our neighbor, right? That's the lens we use. We read a story about a man who's hurt, lying on the side of the road. A priest walks by, a Levite walks by, and they refuse to help him. Perhaps out of fear, distrust, apathy. We don't really know why, but it isn't hard to see the scarcity mindset that they're operating out of. But then we get to the third man, the Samaritan, and he stops. He cares for the injured man. He shows love to his neighbor, a very generous act. He goes above and beyond. He not only stops and bandages the man's wounds, he puts the man on a donkey. He takes him to a place of rest at the inn. He stays and tends to the man for a day. He leaves extra money for others to care for the injured man while he's gone, and he makes a promise to return. That's a lot. That's a beautiful example of generosity. He gives of his own time, his safety, his animal, his money, all to help a stranger. But that's abundant thinking. He's generous with others. He freely offers help. He doesn't have to stop and help. He could have walked on by just like the other two. How often do we make that choice? How often do we say, that's none of my business. I'm not going to look over there. That's not my problem. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he takes a big risk to help this man. Who knows what could have happened to him, but he does it anyway. He sees the best in the world. We know people like that, right? I hope you know someone like that who just sees the good everywhere they look. They're the first to help someone else because they have that attitude that the world is good. They trust that if they were in trouble, someone would help out them, so why not help out someone else? They're willing to go out on a limb to help, to try something new. And change isn't fearful to them, it's exciting and hopeful. They aren't operating out of a sense of guilt or duty or expectation. They're coming from a place of generosity. They want to help. It's the attitude that makes all the difference. Generosity is so much more than giving money. We're so quick to think that generosity is just writing a check. And money was part of the Good Samaritan story, part of his generosity. But what he did was so much more. He became personally invested in the health and well-being of a stranger. He risked his life, limb, and pocketbook in the name of generosity. So how do we move from a scarcity mindset to one of abundance and generosity? First, we do what we've been doing all month. We remember the gifts we have been given. We think about all that we have celebrated this month. God has given us this beautiful, amazing world filled with wonderful people, wonderful animals, the beautiful land and nature all around us. God has given us the chance to have one wild and precious life. What a pity to waste it. God's generosity towards us knows no bounds. There is such generosity of love and spirit in God. We had a conversation in Bible study the other day where we talked about God always being present with us, that there's nowhere on this earth that we can get beyond the presence of God. Now, depending on your view of God, if you see God as a generous and loving God, then that sounds like a wonderful, amazing promise. God is always with me. A promise that no matter what awful thing is happening in my life, no matter how dark the day gets, God's always with us. We are never alone. That's a beautiful promise to lean on in a difficult time. But that idea of God's presence in our lives can also be seen as a threat. If we view God as a stingy, judgmental God without enough love or grace for us, that promise of God's presence in our life can create shame and fear. Oh no, God is always with me. God always knows what I'm doing. We kind of had that talk in Bible study back and forth. How do we see God? Feels like the same idea, we use Santa to scare kids into behaving. He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. It's that same idea, right? But that's a God of scarcity. But we worship and follow a God of love. We are loved beyond our understanding. Love from God for us overflows. God's generosity of love goes all the way to the cross, showing us what risking life and limb looks like. We have a God willing to become a vulnerable baby, part of our world, to live our lives, a life that included joy and pain and tears, hunger, fear, loss, and ultimately death at the hand of the state to be with us and show us what love looks like. That generosity from God spills out into our own lives and helps us to see through that same lens of abundance. God's generosity fuels our generosity. So we can move from a place of closed fist scarcity to an open-handed abundance. When we walk through the world with our hands and our hearts open to possibility, open to collaboration, we can co-create community that welcomes everyone. Community founded in the hope of God. Community that works together to care for those on the edges. Community that shares God's love, knowing there is always enough here in God's kingdom. Amen. The widow of Zarephath thought the end was near. In a time of great doubt, she only had enough meal and oil to prepare one flatbread for herself and her son. And yet, when asked, she was willing to share what she had with a stranger. With great courage, she trusted God's promise to provide for her family. Her story invites us to look at that act of sharing as an act of trust. So let us share generously and courageously, because we can trust God to provide us what we need. I invite you to join me in the offering prayer. Gracious God, we give these gifts because you ask us to share. We dedicate this offering and our lives to your service, that the hungry may be fed, the oppressed may receive justice, and the stranger may be welcomed in our midst. We offer this prayer in the name of the bearer of your good news, Jesus the Christ. Amen.